was a woman named Gazella Weisshaus. The banker told her, unless she had a bank account number, he couldn't help her. They sent her away. 50 years later, Gazella Weisshaus brought the first case against the Swiss banks. Estelle Sapir was a French Jew. She was a tiny woman, not 5 feet tall, I don't think. And her story is somewhat similar to Gazella Weisshaus's. Estelle Sapir lived in Paris. When the Nazis took over France, her father was taken from her, but he was put in a camp where she could go see him through the fence once a day. So when he was taken away and she went to see him, he told her, on my desk, you will find my Swiss bank account and all the information for it. She went to see him until one day he no longer appeared at that fence, and she never saw him again. So when the war was over, she too took a train to Switzerland. She too went to the banker. She too was told, was asked, do you have a bank account number? But she said, yes, I do. And she gave the man the bank account number. And the Swiss banker looked at it and he was astonished. And he said, well, do you have a death certificate for your parents? And she looked at him and she said, should I get it from Hitler or should I get it from Eichmann?
We propose to pay you not more than 170 marks per head. If you are agreeable, we will take possession of the women. We need approximately 150 women. The next letter, these are all in chronological order. We acknowledge your accord. Please prepare for us 150 women in the best possible health conditions as soon as you advise us as soon as you're ready, and we'll take charge of them. The next letter says we received 150 women. Despite their emaciated condition, they were found satisfactory. We shall keep you posted on the developments concerning the experiments. And the last letter says, the tests were made, all subjects died. We shall contact you shortly on the subject of a new load. Signed, Heil Hitler, Bayer, scientific section. And one of the sort of general remarks I always like to make when I talk about these cases is that we have to be humble. There's no amount of money in the world that can compensate Holocaust victims or concentration camp survivors for the horrors that they endured at the hands of the Nazis, or in this case, at the hands of the private sector. However, money is all we have. Lawsuits are the only way we can go about this.
You really need to get into the mentality of us being in a place that we were. We arrived in Auschwitz sometime end of May. We were cooped up in a cattle car for 4 days without any food, water, or a lot of air because there were only 4 little windows at the top of the cattle car. And we were packed in the car like sardines. It was end of May, it was very hot. And so the train would stop only for one reason, to refuel. And when the train would stop, we had a guard by our cattle car. A little booth with a guard with a machine gun. So we asked the guard for water. And he would always say 5 gold watches. Here is a booth that the Nazi guard was, and he's the one we asked for water. So you can imagine these 4 little windows, that was the only air that came in there. And when we gave him the 5 gold watches, pass them through the windows, he would take a bucket of water and throw it in through the window. It was an exercise in futility, because no matter how I put my cup over my head, I never got much more than a couple of drops of water, and I don't think anybody else did either. It was the end of the 3rd day when the cattle car train stopped. We again asked for water, and this time the answer came back, "Bus," "bus," which in German means what? I was 10 years old. I instantly understood what happened. We crossed the border into Germany. Our Hungarian guards have been changed to German, which meant to me that the end was near. My parents decided that they wouldn't teach us Yiddish because they wanted to have a secret language that we, the children, wouldn't understand. So they could talk about all these big problems that were going on, like we didn't feel the problems. And so my father had a rule that at Friday night dinner, we could not speak Hungarian, only Yiddish, except that we couldn't speak Yiddish. At age 8, I told my parents that we should escape to Romania. All we had to do is walk 1 hour by foot and reach the Romanian borders. And my parents said, "You're just a little kid. You don't know anything. We have a roof over our head here. We have food. You go to school. And the Nazis won't come to this tiny little village to pick up 6 Jews." Guess what? I was right and they were wrong. They did come in 1944. The cattle car doors opened. A mass of people poured out into a little strip of land that's called the selection platform. I was there on that selection platform maybe 10 minutes. As we were holding on to my mother, a Nazi was running, yelling in German, "Twins." He approached my mother and demanded to know if we were twins. We were dressed alike and we looked alike. At that moment, another Nazi came, pulled my mother in one direction. We were pulled in the opposite direction. We were crying, she was crying. I never got to say goodbye to her, but I really didn't know that that would be the last time we would see her. The relationship between Mengele and us was a very strange relationship. We knew that we were alive because he wanted us alive for his experiments. And whenever he wanted us dead, he could kill us. And here is my name and my number, Mengele's signature. On Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, we would be taken to another lab that I call the blood lab. There they would tie both of my arms to restrict the blood flow, take a lot of blood from my left arm, and give me a minimum of 5 injections into my right arm. The content of those injections, by the way, came from Bayer Corporation. We didn't know what it was, nor do I know today. But after one of those injections, I became very ill. I had a very high fever. Both arms and legs were swollen, and I had huge red patches the size of an egg or a small apple throughout my body. I was sent to the hospital. Next morning, Mengele came in, never ever examined me. He just looked at the fever chart, and he declared, laughing sarcastically. He said, "Too bad, she's so young. She has only 2 weeks to live." I knew he was right, but I refused to die.
The first case involved cases on behalf of Holocaust survivors against the Swiss banks. What happened was that during the Holocaust, when Jews saw death and destruction all around them, they tried to provide for their families by putting their savings in Swiss banks. The Swiss banks were renowned for being private and being safe. So the Jews put their money, many Jews put their money in the Swiss banks. When the war was over, and the Swiss saw that 6 million Jews had been killed, the Swiss just took their money. And we were there to get that money back for heirs and for the population who was entitled to that money, to disgorge that money from the Swiss banks. A second case that we were actively involved in was a case against German industry on behalf of slave laborers who had been forced to work for the Nazis in industry. Companies that used slave labor and paid the Nazis for it include Volkswagen, Ford Motor Company, Siemens, Krupp, Hugo Boss. Those were all companies that used slave labor, and we were out to get money back for them. Most of the people who were slave laborers were not Jews. They came from many of the countries in the former Soviet Union. They came from Europe, and we sought to get them money back.
The companies we sued included basically every major company in Germany today. One of the things I learned is the German economy is a little bit smaller than ours in terms of major corporations, whereas we have, X number of pharmaceutical companies, they have a smaller number. So when you've sued Bayer and one or two others, you've covered the pharmaceutical industry. When you've sued Krups, and I wish I could remember the other companies off the top of my head, I just don't. When you sue we sued VW, and you sue, all automobile manufacturers were involved in slave labor. And so when I was in Germany on these negotiations, just driving around, one of the things that struck me is every corporate sign I read, everything I passed was a defendant in one of our cases, because it's just a smaller economy. So they have, when you think about the number of cars in this country, number of car brands that are available. In Germany, there's just that many fewer. So you drive around and you see, there's Volvo, we sued them. There's VW, we sued them. There's, I can't remember if Saab was on the list or not, but you see the point. And the same thing with the construction industry is a big part of this. So the names of large construction firms that you see were all defendants in our case. So we had essentially ended up blanketing the entire, all the major players in the German economy with these lawsuits.
The third case, among others, is a case that we brought on behalf of victims of Auschwitz who were twins who suffered at the hands of Dr. Joseph Mengele. Mengele did tortuous experiments on human beings. He would take twins and subject one twin to a horror, to a drug, to a disease like malaria, and then he would use the other twin as the control. In this case, we found that the Bayer company, Bayer Aspirin, had provided the drugs to Dr. Mengele for his experiments and had been present for some of the experimentation. We sued on behalf of those people who were subjected to the drugs.
Well, the first reaction I had, which is probably the same reaction a lot of people might have had, was one of disbelief. And I get this phone call, I'm here in Indianapolis, a Holocaust survivor from the neighboring small town of Terre Haute calls up to say that Swiss bank case you guys are working on is one thing, but let me tell you about a much more important and really serious kind of lawsuit that needs to be brought. And we need to sue Bayer Company for its involvement in performing medical experimentations on prisoners such as myself. And you get a phone call like that and you sort of scratch your head and say, what? And so the first thing I did was challenge her a little bit and say, come on now, where do you get this kind of information? I believe you that you were a victim of medical experimentation, but how on earth can you connect your experiences to the Bayer Aspirin company that we all know as and have bottles of their stuff in our medicine cabinets?
Well, when we first found out that there was an opportunity to visit this historical era and try to bring about some justice, it was very, very exhilarating. It was the opportunity to do something on behalf of people with whom I felt a particular kinship, and it was an awesome task, and it was exciting. As the litigation went on, it became a lot of hard work. We had to fight the Swiss and the Germans on not just the legal front, but also on the public relations front. During the course of the litigation, we had to deal with a number of people who were attacking us. The Swiss banks attacked the lawyers personally, threatened us personally. We had to really put aside the rest of our lives, in large part, to devote to this project. When the cases finally resolved themselves, we were able to point to billions of dollars that we had recovered on behalf of Holocaust victims, but we knew that it was only rough justice. It was not full compensation. We could never right the wrong that occurred, but there was still a sense of satisfaction that we had come to grips with a legal injustice in addition to a misjustice of mankind.
Those cases were filed in court in America, just like the Swiss bank case was. The settlement, unlike the Swiss bank case, the settlement was not handled just by the judge and the lawyers. On the German side, because, like I said, we basically blanketed the entire economy, they got their government involved, and the United States got our government involved. And so we had Stuart Eisenstadt, who was at the time the number 2 man at the United States Treasury, Deputy Treasury Secretary, was sort of the American representative to these discussions, and the Germans appointed a special ambassador to, from their government to represent the Germans along with all the German companies in these discussions. So we'd go to these meetings in Germany, and there'd be the head of VW, and there'd be the head of Krupp's. I mean, these are all major players along with their ambassador, and we, our group of plaintiff lawyers, along with our ambassador, and we went through those negotiations were much more hard fought than the Swiss bank negotiations, perhaps because there's more players involved. The result was a much bigger dollar number. The cases against the German companies were settled for $5 billion. That was a separate government set up fund. It wasn't set up through the court process. And it resulted in payments, again, in amounts that don't change anyone's lives, but in meaningful amounts to, Holocaust survivors all around the world.
See, if you don't forgive, you carry all this baggage. And there is a lot of baggage to carry. And no one can function under the burden of those painful baggages. The tragedy of the war is, and the tragedy of most Holocaust museums, that they want you to leave the museum crying. And I don't think that crying has solved any problems. Anger has not solved any problems. I can sing, I can dance, and I have a lot of fun sitting by my big poster in Auschwitz and smiling. And then some kids, Polish in particular, come there and say, "How dare you smile?" It's my picture. I can smile. I can do what I want.